Hello, and welcome to this video where we'll talk about how to think about improv as a style of writing and creating songs, then as an extension of that, how to formulate a style all on its own. Now, the first thing to talk about is the process itself. So this process takes time to create a song in this manner. So it could be a few hours, it could be a few days, but it could also be a year or more. On average, though, for me, most of my songs formulating this way takes a month or so, maybe a bit more sometimes. So what are we doing in this time? Well, essentially we're building in muscle memory, the physical habits and whatnot, but also the mental side of it. Because obviously songs have stories and that sort of thing, which means we need to be able to make quick decisions to formulate a story, on the fly with our style without expending too much of our mental resources in that moment on it, because it's a sort of careful balance. You have all these elements. You have how you're physically moving your hands, you have your ideas in your head, you have the story you want to create, you have all these things, but you can't allocate too much of your mental energy in the moment to any of them, which means they have to be partly habit, of course, so that you can do them with a low amount of your mental energy being spent on them, so that you have a lot of mental energy to then, make big decisions in the moment or whatever it may be. That's the core of it. That's what we're doing in this time. We're ingraining these habits and whatnot into our playing, which is, again, another careful balance, because, the harder you ingrain these habits into your playing, the harder it's going to be to get rid of them when you want to change styles or when you want to make another song or, whatever. So how do we actually go about doing this? Well, that's what we'll be focusing on for this video, sort of process I've developed that works very well for me. And importantly, it works for the entire duration that the song is being formed, created, because the process is adaptable. You can change little bits of it and how it functions and whatever in the moment to suit whatever need you have in that moment to make your song the best it can be. Essentially, I call this process slow play, because at its most basic form, it is just playing your improv extremely slowly so that you can, get your finger movements exactly right, exactly how you want them, make the exact sounds that you want to come out of the guitar, make the decisions you want, so in the moment you can consciously think, here I want to have something that sounds like this, and then, you can just do all of this exactly how you want it. That's the core of it. That's the core reason we're playing slow. And also keep in mind, it's not like we have a metronome going at like 30 BPM or something and we're sticking to that. No, we're in the moment, we're changing our speed to basically the exact speed we need to be able to do exactly what we want properly. Now let's get into that actual process of slow play itself. So when I'm starting a new song or story or style or whatever, usually I like to go by ear, just by what sounds good in that moment, because that'll just lay down the foundation of the song, of what sort of pleasant sound is going to lead the song. So we'll start with that. So you see there, I hesitated for a second because my finger slipped off the string. That's part of improv, fixing the mistakes. So I did something quickly there. I don't remember now, but I did something quickly there to fix that mistake. And now, let's say I just thought of something I want to do, but I can't do. So for instance, I want to do, but fast. So you see, you can come up against these things you can't do quite easily when you're practicing like this. So you basically have two options here. If it's something that you think you can get down pretty quick, then you just do it extremely slowly until you get it. But then if you think it's something that's going to need more time, then you can, isolate it from this practice, do it on its own, maybe with a metronome if needed or whatever. Practice it that way until you get it down. So we continue from there. let's say from here, I want to make a conscious decision. Let's say I want something sad from here. So that's one option, for instance. But the thing to keep here in mind is that you have basically unlimited options to get any sort of mood, vibe, whatever that you want at any moment in your improv. So that's part of building your skill set. You need to have as many options as you can as muscle memory, able to do it quickly and without mistakes and whatever in the manner that you want to do, and also without much thought. Because again, this goes back to how you want to have as much mental space as you can to think about what matters during a specific improv. And during a specific improv, the most important things are usually the big parts of it, like the story of it itself. You really, if ideally, do not want to be spending your mental energy on something small like how to do your fingering properly for a chord or something like that. You can still get good improvs doing that sort of thinking sometimes, but you really don't want it to be a focus, especially not for an entire improv. That is probably not going to end out well. So anyway, we want to have as many options as we can in the back of our head. So you can literally just figure this out slowly. Again, let's say you have a specific part or chord or something that you find for this song you're building you really like. You've been going back to it a lot. So let's say this chord here. I find myself just going back to that a ton on these specific frets as well. And then I also find that I really like to go into something sad from there again. So then we can just explore our options. Maybe we go into something a bit happier than back to sad there. Or now we're using more strings. So again, this comes back to the options thing. You have to know in the moment your different options in terms of rhythm, texturing, as well as notes. The notes is just one part of it. Now, because this chord, it only uses 2 strings, they're both fairly low sounding. So maybe because of that, I know consciously that from here, I'm probably going to want to add in a higher string for a bit of, texture variety. So maybe I'll focus on looking into those options, the ones with the higher strings in there, so we can form that texture. Another thing you could do, let's say we have those options explored, but then we know that later on in the song, maybe we want to come back to that. Except now, because we want to obviously create a story that changes over time, we want to do it differently this time. So maybe we want to use it as a sort of pivot point into a different rhythm or something. So again, you could explore, all the different options you have of how to use that chord. Because as you saw, I sort of used variations of it afterwards to continue the rhythm change. So yeah, when you're doing this slow play practice over the course of, a few days, you're going to notice certain points that you come back to, certain stuff that it sounds good. So you keep using it, of course. And those are the most important parts to explore in the early stages of forming the song. Because those are the parts that are going to have a big impact on the song as a whole. Now, how do you actually decide which option to work on? Because as we said, there's, infinite really. Well, it comes down to first time. Because of course, you're probably going to have, when you're working on a song, you're probably going to have some sort of deadline in mind or timeline. Maybe you want to get this improv done or refined in like a month so that you can practice with your friend or something. Or it could also just come from the internal side of it, knowing when you're going to get tired of the sounds that this current song is built on. That comes from experience usually, which is why I sort of have the average of like a month is when I know I'm going to want to make big changes to the sound. So that's our first sort of hint. So we want to sort of list the biggest impact things to work on and the, down to the smaller ones later on. So if you have extra time, you can work on one of the smaller ones at the end of it. But you obviously want to check off the high impact stuff at the start. So what is a high value thing to work on then? Well, a big one for me, I think, is pickup switch changing. So, for instance, just because pickup switch changing first, I mean, it can get complex when you get to like changing it with your other hand and stuff like that, changing it while playing a note at the same time. But for the most part, just doing the motion is simple. So first off, we have the amount of time it takes / effort to get it well done is low. So that's a big benefit here, because that's one of the two important things to consider. So that's time / effort. And then the other important thing is how much are you actually getting out of it? And this is why pickup switch changing is such a great thing to implement into your playing, because you can get so much out of it. Because you can do so much. The creativity, the options there are crazy. For instance, you can use it for just a small, tiny change in your texture. You're playing, and then maybe you want one specific note to be different pickups, something like that. Just one note, little bit of texture change in there, little tone change. So that can just create a little bit of value there. And it's super easy, again. But then on the other hand, you can make huge changes to the story of your song using a pickup change. So we could have this section with this pickup setting, and then imagine that this section has been going on for like 30 seconds or something. And then we completely change how I'm playing and at the same time change the pickup setting. So that will create a huge effect on the story. So simple. So again, just imagine that was a long period of time. So you can see in that example, it would have a way higher impact on the story of the song itself. But all in all, these are just two of the examples, both done with the exact same movement. So if you practice one, you practice the other. That's the beauty of pickup switch changing, why the amount of time and effort is so low. And the results are great. Now, another thing we have to keep in mind when we're talking about what to focus your work on, is just the deadline, the time element of it, if you do have that. Because sometimes you kind of just have to stop working on a certain idea or whatever, a certain thing you're trying to implement into the specific song before you're done. So for instance, a few months ago, I was working on switching the capo as I'm playing, midway. So I had a sort of vision in mind, a goal in mind. I saw possibilities in my head of like a end goal, how I'd be able to do it in my playing. And I didn't reach it. I got bored after a few days of working on capo changes. I got bored. And once you get bored with an idea, your efficiency is going to go down, crazy amounts, which means you're going to be wasting time, essentially. So I just left it there. Even though I hadn't reached the goal, I just left it there. Even months later now, I still haven't reached that initial end vision I had. Even though I didn't reach it yet, still in that initial time that I spent working on it, I got it to a higher level. And I implemented that into my improving. So I still got value out of that time. This also comes back to knowing when to stop, because obviously, there's different stages of implementing something into your playing. So when you get that feeling that you might not finish with the current thing or whatever that you're implementing into the improv, you want to try to cut it off at one of those points that you waste the least amount of time, essentially. And that just comes with experience mainly. So let's go into that process of implementing a certain technique or whatever into your playing and look at that more in depth than before. There's basically 3 steps to it, I like to think. And oftentimes you can skip the second step, but we'll get into that. So the first step is just finding something, of course, that you actually want to implement. So for me, most of the time, this just happens naturally as I'm doing the, slow play. I try to do something, I realize I can't do it, and then I have to work on it and implement it. So obviously there's a ton of different ways to find something to implement. A lot of times it can also happen by accident. Like one time I slammed my thumb on the string like that and got that sort of percussive sound. And then I realized, well, that's a percussive sound that I can use to, put some rhythm into the playing and whatnot. So accidents is a common one. Another one is trying to recreate something you hear in a song. So again, I heard a synth sort of thing in one song, and I couldn't really figure out how to replicate it. The closest thing I could get was tapping the strings with like flat fingers like this, or extended fingers. So I implemented that by playing. Then of course you can just learn from other people, because when you're watching those great players who've been playing like 10, 15 years plus, they're pretty much always going to have a bunch of tricks and a bunch of little things they do that you can implement into your own playing. Anyway, now that we have that thing, the second step is being able to do it well in isolation, essentially. So like I said, this step you can skip. Sometimes if you find something you can do well right out of the gate, then you can skip it. But most of the time you want to spend some time on it, sometimes more time than others. So you just want to make sure you can do the thing well. Basically, let's say, for an example, I want to do AMI sort of flick thing. Then I just have to be able to do that comfortably in different ways by itself. So I practice that. Let's say I want to do it with some chords. And then you see I implemented a few small changes to it. Maybe I want to add in the pinky. So I do that. Anyway, eventually you'll get comfortable enough with it. You can, figure out this point through experience and stuff. You'll feel it. And that's when we get to the implementing phase. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this third step. And again, it kind of depends on the thing itself. And you'll be able to feel this through experience. Sometimes the best way to implement it is to just pretend you're playing a regular improv. And then whenever the moment comes up that you want to put that thing in, you put it in, of course. But sometimes you might want to spend a little bit of time playing improvs where you sort of purposefully play in a certain way to bring up those situations when you want that new thing in the improv. Or you could even just force it in, completely force it in if you want. I mean, you can see there's kind of a gradient here. Like there's the completely isolated playing of the new thing here. And then on the other end, there's playing a regular improv where you're just using it in those specific moments that you want to use it. But obviously there's all this time in the middle, or all this space in the middle. So moving along that gradient is a skill that you'll learn through doing this. I'll take a bit of a step back and look at the other side of this. So far we've mainly been talking about this sort of slow play practice part of it, but obviously there's also the other part of the actual real-time, full-speed, proper attempts at a, refined result, an improv, a song, whatever, something usable, maybe. So it's essentially a balance, and generally, the later you get into that process of creating the entire song, then the more you're going to do the full-speed attempts. So let's look at how that balance actually plays out. So let's say we've spent maybe an hour or so working on just slow practice, figuring out ideas and whatnot. Maybe I'm specifically trying to work on the capo switches. Then I want to do a full speed attempt at it. So what's the point of these full speed attempts? Well, it's basically so you can just see how everything's going. You can see any mistakes, you can see anything you don't like. Yeah, you can just see all that. So we'll do a pretend attempt here, and I'll do a mistake so that we can see that. So we just end that off early for the sake of the example. So you can see there I had two mistakes actually. Well, just for the purpose of the example, we'll say I had two mistakes. So the first obviously was that I didn't move the capo properly, so my lowest string is kind of hitting the capo. At least on that first change it was. So that's one thing I would see in this full speed, because maybe when I was doing the slow play, obviously it would be a lot easier to get an accurate switch. So maybe I wasn't making that mistake, but now I am when I go for the full thing, so I know what to work on there. And the other thing I could say I didn't like was that both times that I did the switch, I did it in the same way, which is, you know, doing a sort of 2-finger tap with the right hand. So maybe I'm not happy with the various ways that I'm doing the switch. Maybe I want to implement, you know, some thumb in there. Or maybe I want the left hand to do something, you know, whatever it may be. I could see that as well in the full speed thing. Because obviously when you're doing the slow play practice, your sense of time gets distorted. And it's a lot harder to see certain parts of the playing clearly. Which again, you'll learn what parts these are and what to pay more attention to in the full speed reviews as you go on. So yeah, when you're looking at your full speed playing, maybe keep a notepad open on your computer or whatever and just write down what you need to work on, what's bugging you. Write down what works as well, keep that in mind, and go from there. So the entire process is essentially just cycling from these slow play periods where you're implementing stuff, you know, getting stuff right the way you want it, and then these faster reviews sessions where you look at your mistakes, see what you're doing wrong, see what you want to change, and then back to the slow play to implement those changes. So the main thing that's changing over the course of the entire thing is what exactly you're working on in each of these cycles. So before we conclude this, let's look at the slow play practice session in depth one more time. I'll get into a little example here myself doing slow play practice and sort of vocalize what I'm thinking in the moment about what to work on and what I notice and all that. But first, let's talk about that for a second. What we work on. Well, we said it needs to be high value and whatnot, but on top of that, there's sort of 2 types of mistakes you can make. Just for the sake of the video, we're going to simplify, generalize here. There's 2 types of mistakes you make. So the first is, of course, mistakes that are sort of ingrained into your playing, that you've accidentally made into a habit or whatever. So for instance, maybe I have a habit of when I'm tapping with my right hand, I let my palm here run along the low strings and make sound. That is actually a bad habit I have. So, you know, that's an example of something that is my fault, and these are the sort of examples you want to focus on generally. Because, of course, these are the ones that are happening consistently and for a specific reason, usually. Now, the other type of mistakes are sort of just like random stuff that can just happen whenever. So, you know, for instance, one that happens to everyone is just accidentally plucking the wrong string with your right hand. Of course, that one could also be ingrained. They all could be ingrained. But obviously, you should know yourself as a player. You should know which of your mistakes are ingrained habits and whatnot, and which of them are just random, you know, just on that day for whatever reason you're making that mistake. So you want to focus on those ingrained ones. So keep that in mind as you watch this. So for the sake of this example, let's just say I'm working on changing the capo as I play. And also we'll say this is pretty far along that gradient we talked about, meaning that I'm not going to be forcing the capo changes in. I'm going to just pretend this is a regular improv and do the capo changes when I want to do the capo changes. Let's get into it then. So right there, the rhythm I had there, the timing on the notes is not what I would want to have during a full real-time one, but I changed it there obviously just so I could play it the way I want to play it. I've had a few moments where I've gone too fast. Now this is a problem that can come up pretty often. You kind of just forget that you're supposed to be doing it slowly. And also there's certain stuff you practice especially when it comes to obviously rhythm timing, where you are going to want to try to do it at the actual speed that you want to do it, and that's going to be better practice than doing it slowly. Again, this just comes with experience and knowing which of those will be like that. I didn't have the notes ring out properly there, but that's one of those mistakes I'm not going to worry about because that's a more random mistake. Happy with the way the rhythm's going. So I'm trying to change that. Another thing I've noticed is I'm overutilizing certain chord positions with my left hand. Positions where the middle finger sort of does the low note, and then you have something like this, or something like that, but centered around the middle finger. That's a big problem I have with my playing right now. Again, the note didn't ring out properly there, that's fine. Random mistake, but also a thing I'm noticing is these sort of sections of having something ring out that I've been doing repeatedly throughout this particular session. Now, obviously, if you want to have those, that's fine, but it's something I've noted in my head. And, maybe, again, this is where your mental mental energy comes into play. Because if this was a real full-time improv, and I noticed that I've been doing this ringing out of sections of parts, then that means that I could use that to my advantage. Because, obviously, if I want to have a big change in the song, let's say at one point, I could do it through ruining or manipulating this expectation that the listener now has of parts ending with this sort of ring out section. So I'll do that here. One thing I've noticed is I didn't change the rhythm properly to accommodate for that change in the ringing out thing. I think a better rhythm change to sort of stagger it more would have worked better. Now again, a lot of these things I'm mentioning are things you would actually notice during the fast-paced process as well, the part where you record and then review, but that's fine. Now another thing I've noticed is I'm not separating the layers properly or enough as much as I want the playing. The bass parts often get sort of a focus, and then I realize I've been focusing on the bass parts too much, so then I try to throw in some higher string parts, and it creates a sort of unhealthy dynamic that I'm not super in control of. So that is one of the big things I want to work on, so I'm noting that in my head, of course. And I'm back to that ringing out thing and that rhythm I had back then during that section. I also have that problem with my capo switches right now, where I often have the strings ringing out as I do it, which can be okay, can create a cool sound, but I do it almost every time, so it's repetitive. one thing I was able to do at the end there was change up the ending. So I was almost ending with, these sort of percussive elements like that. But then I remembered that that's something I'm trying to get away from, because a lot of my improvs have been lately ending with these percussive elements by themselves. I wanted to change that, and because it's slow play, I can easily do that consciously in the moment. Although even in a fast play, again, if you had the mental energy thing, if you weren't thinking about other parts of the playing, you would be able to do that as well in the moment. Just something to consider there. Now, you heard me vocalize what I wasn't happy with, what I wanted to change, what fix, etc. So the next step for me here obviously would be to decide what I want to work on. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about is that sometimes you can work or implement on, multiple things at the same time. It is usually better to have that one main focus, but sometimes you can just work on like 2, 3, even 4, sometimes smaller things at the same time. What's important is that they can all be worked on at the same time without sacrificing the quality of the practice, of course. So these would be, as I said, quite small things. Like, for example, maybe you notice that when you're tapping on the high strings, you don't tap hard enough and you get a really quiet sound like that. So you want to do a hard one, as I showed there. Now, the reason that you'd be able to practice this at the same time as other things is because you can practice it while doing that last step of the gradient we talked about. That step where you're basically just doing it improv as if it's the real thing, but slower. You're not focused on, trying to force something, you're trying to implement whatever. You're just doing the improv as if it's a real improv, but slower. So then, since, as you're doing that, when you do a part where you're tapping the high strings, because of how slow you're playing, you can make sure that you fix that you tap hard as you want or whatever. So yeah, if you have a bunch of these smaller things, you can often work on them if the conditions are met and whatnot. Now, another thing here to talk about that we haven't addressed yet, when you're doing this slow play practice and you make a mistake, let's say I try to do 3 pull 0, and I accidentally go back with my finger and mute the string. Do you do that again, but correctly, the way you wanted it to do it? Or do you pretend that it's a real improv and that you made that mistake in the moment and now you have to alter how you're playing to make the mistake sound as if it was on purpose, as if it's a real improv? So maybe I mute the string by accident, and then on my next thingy, I also mute the string to make it sound like the first one was on purpose. So the question of when you're slow playing, which one of those two do you do? Essentially, I think it is case specific. So again, it comes with experience, but for the sake of the video, we can simplify and say you want to sort of figure out what type of player you are, what your strengths and weaknesses are. So for instance, for me, I know that one of my biggest strengths as an improv player is fixing my mistakes in the moment and, making them sound like they were on purpose, which means that when I do slow play practice, a lot of the time I like to focus more on doing the thing properly, going back and doing the thing the way I initially wanted to do it in the first place, because that works on my weakness, which is, playing it properly. I make a lot of mistakes. It just doesn't sound like it because I'm good at fixing them. So that's my, basic guideline there. Just work on whatever one you're weaker at during your slow play practice. To conclude, let's go over the entire process, but in a more broad manner. So we start off with that stage where we're just trying to figure out what sort of sound we want in this specific improv, what sounds interest us at that time or whatever. Often we do that by just following our ear, so to speak. But remember that, of course, you have a past, a history of playing different songs, different styles. So oftentimes you can, incorporate that. Maybe you decide for this next song you're about to start, maybe you decide you want to combine one of your old styles, but just mix in your new skill at switching the capo or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways, obviously, that you can reach that first preliminary idea of the sound for a song. Then from there, we're just implementing new ideas, improving them by combining that slow play practice with the fast play practice. And finally, as we near the end, you'll get this feeling that you'll be getting more and more good improvs in your fast play real time recordings and whatnot. You'll be getting more and more good recordings, ones that you like, enjoy, etc. And that will sort of be the indicator that it's about time to actually get the final recordings of this specific idea, song, etc. that you're working on. And that's when you'll almost entirely stop the slow play practice, unless you still need some, and you just mainly focus on that recording part. And by this point, you should have the core of this specific improv pretty much down, right? Which means that you can now make variations to it, add variables to it. You can do that sort of thing. Meaning when you're trying to get that final recording, the one or even sometimes 2 or 3 recordings that are it for that specific song, you can experiment a lot with different ideas. For instance, you could play a song beforehand, maybe one of your favorite songs, and then just try to implement some of its rhythms afterward into an improv attempt. And maybe that'll, be the spin on that core you've built that you need to get a great recording. Of course, I'm not going to go over everything because, again, there's, infinite ways that you can adjust this core. But that's the important thing, that you have that core, and now we can do whatever needs to be done to get a great recording or whatever you want out of that idea. That's the main sort of way we can complete this process, create that core that we can then use for, whatever we want, playing with other people, use for a recording, for a song we're making, whatever you want to do with it. Finally, let's conclude by just mentioning how important it is to actually listen to the sound, the actual sound that's coming out of the guitar. Because while you're improving, especially while you're doing the real-time part of it, not the slow play part of it, it's super easy to get caught up mentally with, dedicating a lot of your mental energy, mental space to focusing on the story or something you want to improve on, the rhythm, whatever it may be. And you don't leave enough of that mental energy for listening to the actual sound coming out of the guitar. So this can mean that you don't fix mistakes you make. Just as an example, that's one of the biggest problems that can come up in improv if you don't actually listen to the sounds coming out of the guitar. Because you won't realize a mistake you make, something that changed the sound, and so you won't fix it. For instance, let's say I'm doing a tapping thing here. Something super simple. And then I accidentally sort of lift my hand and my palm thumb area makes a noise on the low strings. A super common mistake you can make while tapping. So if you're not listening closely to the actual sounds coming out of the guitar, you might not notice that because you might be focused on just the mental part of it. You might, know in your mind what you're trying to do, and you'll just assume that that's the sound you're getting when it might not be. So that's essentially why it's super important to focus on the actual sound, leave enough of your mental energy available to focus on the actual sound while you're improvising. Also remember to just have fun, because obviously it's fun to have fun, but also the more fun you have, the more efficiently you're going to work, the more you're going to want to work, all of that stuff. That's about it. Any questions, ask in the comments, and thanks for watching. Enjoy and shit like that.